to your Wow Factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to the Wow Club. I'm Michelle Martin. 24-year-old Alaa Murabit is a pioneer for women's rights in Libya. She comes from a family of 10, where conversations in the devoutly Muslim family often revolved around the place of women. For the first 15 years of her life, those conversations took place in Saskatchewan, Canada. But when at the age of 15, Alaa Murabit decided to pursue studies in medicine, the family, headed by her stay-at-home mom and doctor father, decided to move to Libya. And it was there that her sense of gender awareness moved from dialogue to reality.
But I think that education is key. And I think it's not education in the classroom, chalkboard style, but I mean education about what the discussion is. Because when it comes to women's rights, in Libya at least, we are being excluded from the conversation. We're 70% of NGOs, but we are not the decision makers. Conversations about us, about our rights, about our bodies, about our responsibilities are being had at 10 p.m. in rooms that we are not allowed to go in. And the discussion revolves around religious rights, which are misinterpreted and misused, around culture and around tradition, where if we do speak up, people say, well, you're a bad Muslim woman. And it becomes very personal very quick. So we're being excluded from these conversations. And for so many years, we've allowed that to happen. We've said, okay, well, I don't want my personal, status to be involved in this discussion. And what we need to do is, if we cannot force ourselves into those conversations, we need to start to make new conversations. We need to start to make conversations about women after we have educated women about their rights, be it religious rights, which are extremely important because that is how these regimes thrive. Both autocratic regimes and the more extreme regimes thrive through using religion. Which is interesting because autocratic regimes attempt to pretend they're liberal, and yet a lot of their policies towards women use tradition and culture and mislabel it as religion because they know religion is something you cannot debate with. So, for example, in our campaign, in the Noor campaign in Libya, we've taken Quran is our holy book. We've taken verses from it, and we've taken hadiths, which are sayings by the Prophet ﷺ, and we've used those in conversations with women and men. And that is where I think we need to start putting our focus on. We need to change the dialogue because we do not need we don't need to be the victims. We're not the victims. I mean, we've raised these men. Every boy that carries a gun in Libya has a mother, and you can bet at home she's the one in charge. So we need to just make sure that that's seen on the street.
Dr. Alaa Murabit, my guest in the Wow Club. You heard her there speaking on a panel moderated by John Stewart. Zainab Salbi, co-creator, was part of that panel as well. But Dr. Alaa Murabit still practices medicine. Her field is pediatrics, but really it's her work as founder of the Voice of Libyan Women, a women's empowerment and development NGO in Libya that has the world sitting up. Her voice and message is such a powerfully important one that she was on the wanted list in Libya during the year of the revolution. Just how is this 24-year-old helping to change the national conversation of the role of women in Libya? While researching, I looked through Alaa Murabit's Twitter page days before meeting her. An entry on the 21st of September on her Twitter feed read, nearly 48 hours straight without electricity in Zawiya. The only thing that didn't stop was the fighting. How does one organize in a country where peace, not to mention electricity, cannot be taken for granted, and where security concerns can be extremely grave? What has the Arab Spring meant for women's rights in Libya? Find out in tonight's edition of Women of Worth. Welcome. I'm Michelle Martin. Welcome to Wow, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Today, what a special edition. It is such an honor to welcome to Wow the founder of the Voice of Libyan Women, Dr. Alaa Murabit. Dr. Murabit, thank you for being here. Does women's empowerment and religious re-education go hand in hand in Libya?
I think in Libya, the context that we have currently is very much that the limitation of women's rights has been very much something that's been indoctrinated in the culture. And unfortunately, it's being excused by religious misuse and manipulation. And so in order to really change the cultural dynamic and change the social apparatus there, you really do have to delve into the understanding of religion and religious re-education and ensuring that people are well aware of the rights and roles that women do have in religion, and how they can in fact empower them into leading in public life rather than minimize their roles.
Have you ever felt, or has anyone ever imposed on you, the sense of a tension between being a good Muslim and a woman who is fighting for gender equality?
Interestingly enough, yes. And, and the interesting thing here is it comes from both sides. It comes both from Muslims as well as from, foreigners and people who don't necessarily live in Libya and are not Muslims. And I think the reasoning is twofold. In one sense, and this happens everywhere, women are attacked based on their sense of honor. Right? So this may be something physically, this may be religious, but women are attacked. Their morality is the first thing that goes, and people try to destroy your reputation if they don't necessarily like what you're saying. And so usually the key way to get to that, at least in the Middle East, is through faith. So you can easily attack a woman based on her religion, and you can say, well, if she were a better Muslim, she wouldn't be talking about women's rights. And then on the very flip side, you do have the more Western views where you can't be a Muslim and a women's rights activist. It just doesn't make sense to them. So they're very, very differing views, but they kind of go hand in hand in terms of how you have to react to both of them.
What is your answer to the question, are you a feminist?
I personally believe that feminism is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and equal access to roles and skills and resources. And they should equally be responsible for the maintenance of a nation, and they should be equally responsible for education, and they should be equally responsible for healthcare and security and peace building. And I don't see anything in the term feminism that implies anything otherwise. So I'm very proud to work towards women's empowerment in that regard. And I think that unfortunately people tend to skew feminism and say, well, that means you don't like men, or that means you're saying that, women are better than everyone. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that they should have equal rights and roles in society.
With your work in Libya, is there a need to qualify the term feminism with Asian feminism, Islamic feminism, or anything in addition to the word feminist?
No, because we don't have a term for the word feminist in Arabic.
Interesting.
Yeah, women are just women, right? And you just are supportive of women's rights. So we don't necessarily have a term for feminism, and I tend to get into this conversation more when I'm out of Libya. When people say, well, are you an Islamic feminist? And I'm like, I don't see a difference between, and for me personally, when I abide by the rules of my faith, it's as much as abiding by international standards. They have the same international legal standards, right? So they have the same basis of respect, of dignity, of honor, of work ethic, of responsibility, and of rights. And so if I hold strength to both of those, then I don't necessarily see the need to define myself by anything else.
Share with us the terrain that you're working in. It's a stew of tribal hostilities and township hostilities, much in part sown during the Gaddafi era, or perhaps years before that as well. Do people use stereotypes of religion and feminism to hold women back?
Thank you for bringing up this question. It's actually the funniest thing about Libya is whenever I go somewhere, they say, well, it's religious warfare. And I love that you said township hostilities, because that's what it is. It's historical, regional, and tribal conflict. It really, and yes, religion is a good way to get people passionate. So if you want to get power and you want people to buy into your cause, you use religion, because what's more powerful than God, right? God will be happy with you. So of course people are going to start to get excited. But ultimately what it comes down to is power plays in a country that is void of a security apparatus and is void of political boundaries. So it's much easier to get that power. And women, as much as youth, as much as even men, are used in this. And particularly when it comes to religion, in a way to prove that you're the most religious, you take the rights away from the young women first and foremost, right? So unfortunately, that's the current context, and that's the current terrain. And really what it comes down to, unfortunately, is just regional and tribal conflict, which has, because of the complete lack of security and political control, has been allowed to fester and grow and really dominate.
Is political instability then the root of discrimination, in your opinion?
I think political instability is both the root of the problem as well as the real solution. So once you can achieve political stability, and it's very interesting, this is, I don't remember the saying, I think chicken or egg. So this is the chicken or the egg, where you have, in order to get political stability, you need security, right? But in order to get security, you need political powers, which people trust, to create a national army. In order to do this, you're also going to need to strengthen your economy so that young men don't want to go and join militias and crime groups, right? But in order to do this, you need education for the young men to be able to become economically, able. So this is very much a cyclical thing where we keep seeing that it's almost as if people look at the situation and say, well, it's all too difficult. So let's just keep doing what we've been doing, which hasn't been working for 3 years, and hope it'll finally work out. When it won't, we need to start taking a step back and saying, okay, what are the immediate steps? And I think ultimately the first step needs to be transitional justice and a constitution. And it needs to be from people who are in politically respected positions. And in order for it to be truly sustainable, in order for you to create sustainable peace, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to involve the women. Because despite the fact that relatively in Libya, women have less political positions and they aren't necessarily as economically powerful, what they do own entirely is community networks. They own community leadership. They are the role models. They tend to have a very, very powerful voice in a private realm. And so you have to remember there are spheres of power in this, and women tend to dominate the community sphere of power. It may not be official, but it matters, because when you're talking about conflict resolution and when you're talking about tribal warfare, you need the women in the family to say, we are done. We will not continue to fight. Because politicians are not going to come to individual families and tribes and say, no, we've made deals. It won't happen. It needs to be done on a local level. So women are imperative to it.
How do you organize for women's rights in a terrain where women have been kept in the back room and silent for so long, and internet penetration is so low?
Well, for us, immediately after the revolution, there was this want and this desire for human rights in general. And so we really capitalized on that, and we really pushed for women's rights at that time and took advantage of that time frame. More recently, because the situation has deteriorated in terms of security, that's obviously been more difficult. And so in an answer to that, my organization chose then to set up local city teams, because initially the first 2 years of VLW, we would ourselves travel throughout the country to all 33 other cities, and we'd go and we'd do the women's charter, and we'd go to the schools and such, and the security situation became so that it was literally impossible for us to be able to do that. And at the same time, we did not want to neglect those communities in our research and in our work and in our campaigns. So we created local city teams where we brought them all together for a workshop, trained them in the campaign, created team leaders, and then they went back. And the beauty of it was that these now weren't women's rights organizations. These are lawyers and teachers and doctors and young men and young women and university professors and all these different professions coming together, and businessmen saying that, we need to talk about domestic violence, or we need to talk about violence against women. And it created a dynamic in which it was much more powerful and stronger. So it was done out of necessity, but, thankfully worked out in our benefit.
You're listening to Wow, I'm Michelle Martin. We're in conversation with Dr. Alaa Murabit. More after this.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live. Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
My special guest this evening is Dr. Alaa Murabit. She was in Singapore at the invitation of the Singapore Committee of UN Women for their Snow Gala. Dr. Murabit was selected as a Trust Woman Hero Award finalist by the Thomson Reuters Foundation. You're listening to Wow, Women of Worth. So glad you're with us here for a very special edition of Wow. We're with the founder of the Voice of Libyan Women, and you can read up more on them at facebook.com/the Voice of Libyan Women. Dr. Alaa Murabit here in Singapore at the invitation of the Singapore Committee of UN Women. Dr. Murabit, you grew up in Canada till the age of 15, and then you left for Libya to study medicine. When did you get the sense that your essence was limited by gender?
Well, I was born and raised in Canada. I completed high school at 15 and then moved to Libya to study medicine. And I can honestly tell you, if you asked me when I was 14 or 15 my opinion on women's rights, I'd be like, what are you talking about? Because I have 10 brothers and sisters, 5 brothers and 5 sisters. And the women in my family tend to be the ones who were treated equally to my brothers, have always excelled. You know, my sister's a pediatric plastic surgeon, and my dad was the one who would push her to be better and do more. So that was the family I grew up in. I never felt limited by gender on any level, and it was very much an education-first family. So whoever got the best marks was my dad's favorite. This was a known fact in the family. When I moved to Libya, I started medicine, and very early on, I began to feel that regardless of whether or not they had merit or whether or not their opinions were more qualified, they were more respected, my male counterparts and my male classmates.
This is at 15.
Yeah, this was when I went to Libya at 15. And so that was kind of the first hint of it. And I didn't really pay any attention to it until I kind of got, because my assumption was that this is a country where nobody has had any real rights. And so that just might be the manifestation of that. But instead, over the years, it became very apparent that it was very much focused on ensuring that women understood that even if you get a degree, you're probably not going to use it for work. You're probably going to stay at home. And it was the way that the society worked. So within my first year of medical school, our university did not have any women on the student council. And
You were the first.
Yeah, I struggled to do that. And I became the first woman on the student council. And genuinely did not feel as though once I left medical school, it would limit me. I genuinely didn't at the time. I said, you know what, your gender only matters in these walls because, this is university and they probably, the women were 75% of the graduates. They were much more. They're very well educated women. So I was saying the men being a smaller percentage want to show their strength or whatnot. And it wasn't until after I kind of began to experience more of outside society that I realized that no, it was actually something that would follow me through.
What is the reality of life as a woman in a conflict zone or a zone in transition? Do you drive, for example? Tell me about traveling.
No, I drive. I travel. Honestly, the situation deteriorated quite recently. So only recently have I been more limited in my movements. And I think that that's with any conflict zone in the world. So if you go to Africa, Latin America, even parts of Europe, it would be very difficult to have movement for really anyone, man or woman. And given my particular occupation, it's a bit more difficult for me to maneuver. But I genuinely think that ultimately what it comes down to is once you have a clear security apparatus and once you have clear control of the current situation, then you might be able to have more movement. And I don't think it has to do as much with gender as it does with just a general feeling of fear from everyone.
What are the major challenges facing Libyan women today?
The major challenges facing Libyan women are very much the same ones facing all of Libyan society. This is a society that even no one has felt as though they have human rights and dignity for decades. So Did the
Arab Spring change that in any way?
I think it was a momentary feeling of kind of success. People were excited and rejoiced, but I think that it was very much like, and how do I say this in the best way? Very much like, actually it was giving people who have never seen weapons, right? So it was like opening a kid in a candy store. And it was giving people who have never had control, full control. Mm-hmm. Giving the opportunity for media to be completely unaccountable and uncontrolled. And I'm not saying you need a police state. Believe me, I'm not. I've been raised both in a democratic nation, and I've lived for the past 10 years of my life in a nation that was much more of an authoritarian regime. And I can honestly say there is a beauty in rights, but there needs to be much more of an understanding of civic responsibility. And that's something that unfortunately we miss in Libya right now. Mm. So people keep demanding their rights and they say, well, I want to be heard and I need to be listened to. In order to be heard, you have to have something worth saying. You have to research. You have to be accountable, right? And you have to be respectful. These are the terms of any conversation you would have. And that, for women, I think entirely they're being excluded from the political sphere on a substantial level. They're being excluded economically, and that's something that we can't say is a women's issue anymore because it's a societal issue. It's a country in conflict, so even men are not able to function economically right now. You don't have very many businessmen whose businesses are thriving. So it's really about solving the very core issues in society, which is ensuring that we have political stability and only being able to do that through transitional justice and reconciliation and creating a national army and creating an actual security apparatus, and moving from there, creating positions where we can put women and men in areas of conflict resolution and conflict management and peace building and economic power. And it's really just ensuring that we do this as a community and as a society.
My guest this evening is Dr. Alaa Murabit. Newsweek has named her one of 25 women under 25 to watch, just 24 years old, and so much accomplished. She's changing the conversation in Libya when it comes to women's rights. Hear more from Dr. Alaa Murabit, my special guest in WOW, after headline news.
Add to your Wow Factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live. Add to your Wow Factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
24-year-old Dr. Alaa Murabit is my special guest this evening. She was here in Singapore at the invitation of the Singapore Committee of UN Women for their Snow 2014 Gala. Here's more of the interview. Listening to WOW, I'm Michelle Martin. We're chatting with Dr. Alaa Murabit, just 24, and a leader in many individuals' views, in many individuals' minds when it comes to women's rights in Libya. Do you see yourself as a leader of women's rights in Libya?
I got involved in women's rights quite accidentally. It was because of the work that I had done during the revolution and you know, the potential I saw at that time and the aspirations I think all women and all communities have.
Is there a moment that crystallized this sense of political activism for you?
Honestly, no. It just became so throughout the revolution, my brothers were fighting and my father was a doctor. He was for the revolutionary forces. And my community is very pro-revolution. And I was told, because the Gaddafi forces were within the streets and it was blockaded, they said, you have to go to school. I was in fifth year medicine at the time, my final year, and they said, you have to show up. We don't want the international community to think anything is wrong. So we would go to the hospital and we would assist with getting medical supplies and kind of taking them out. And it was never a political statement. It was never, to me, it was never about women's rights. It was about, this was a revolution and everyone is going to do their part and I'm a citizen as equal to anyone else. And so I will do my part. And as I saw more and more women in my community, because the men were now no longer in the homes or some of the boys were in hiding and some of them were fighting, women started taking on much more active roles. So they would be even something as simple as driving a car. A lot of women hadn't chosen to learn that before and suddenly they were learning. And I felt like it was a great opportunity if we're going to talk about giving dignity and human rights or allowing for these for individuals to feel those rights or to have those rights, then women should have that same opportunity. So it really was never on purpose. You know, I wasn't.
You were acquainted with former U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, who was killed in the line of duty by a rocket attack in Benghazi, murdered by terrorists. He died advancing American interests and values, which he was committed to, even if it meant putting himself in danger. I'm paraphrasing Hillary Clinton here. What are your views on international intervention? For example, airstrikes versus the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Does the international community, in terms of what they're doing right now, is it helping your work on the ground in any way?
Honestly, I think when it comes to such culturally kind of embedded issues, such as women's rights, I think it has to be indigenous. I think the change has to come from the women themselves, women of Libya, the men of Libya, but it has to be something which is very sustainable. And in order for it to be sustainable, it has to be an internal change and an internal shift of mentality. And I do think that the international community in some ways does assist with resources for organizations or with training or even kind of there are or with awareness, let's say. But I don't personally think that military options are always the best options. I do think that there is a time when you do need to take military action. I completely and wholeheartedly agree. But I don't think that should always be the first resort. Because I think once you're finished the military action, you may have subdued the other person, but you've, number one, gained more animosity from that side, and that will come back. It will, right? And it will continue to fester and it will continue to grow. And the reason I say this is because Libya's had the same regional and tribal conflicts for decades. These are not new conflicts. Now they're much more apparent because everybody has weapons and takes a very military approach to it. But these have existed for a long time. And because they've never been resolved, they will continue to exist and they will continue to grow. And so I think a show of force can very rarely bring sustainable peace. And I think the only way to do that is to really go through, give people closure through justice and through political means and through actual conversation and dialogue and cohesion. But I don't think force is always the first way to go.
So what are your views on external intervention in Libya?
Currently?
Yes.
I don't think it would impact positively. I think it would actually give greater strength to the sides who say, well, international countries are going to come in and they're going to, burn the ground we walk on. And I think that, there is obviously resources being given to particular sides and whatnot, but I don't think it would make sense to have actual international troops or forces on the ground in Libya. Not right now. Are
there never-ending threats to life when it comes to the work of advocates in Libya?
Yes.
That is the reality.
That is the reality.
Why do you continue to do what you do? You're 24 years old. The world is your oyster. Presumably you can live any way you want to. Why do you continue to do what you do? At great risk to yourself.
My parents are very devout. And I was raised in a very Muslim home. And it's important to understand that it had none of the cultural influence of Libya. It was just very much a Muslim home. And I was raised, since I was very young, that you give back to the community what you can. That's why you're here. You're here to give back to people and to make life easier for those, if you are able to. And I was also raised that whatever will happen or should happen is going to happen. Whatever God has decreed will happen. And it's very much kind of the English idea of destiny. Mm-hmm. So what is your destiny will happen, right? And when I started VLW and when the situation has slowly started to deteriorate, it comes to mind that I'm in a position where I have phenomenal support from my family. And I've brought a lot of people into my organization and into this cause. And if I, in my position and with the opportunities that I've had and with the resources that I've been given, we're not going to follow through on this, then it would be unlikely that anybody else would. And I could not fault them because their situation would probably be much more difficult and they probably didn't have those same resources and those same opportunities and that same support. I think that you are given certain things in life and that you have to give back, if that makes sense.
Are women participating in the push for greater participation for women in Libya?
Women are. I mean, so when we first started, we did the Women's Charter, and we went down to different communities throughout Libya. And one woman said something to me that will last, I think. This was probably the moment where I said, you have to follow through on this, and you have to see this through. And that was when I asked her about security. She said, have you ever, and in Libya, we drive very fast. Like 140 is considered slow.
This is the norm.
Yeah, this is the norm. And there's no, traffic laws. And so she said, have you ever been in a car as it's going down the freeway and you're in the passenger seat and you're holding on to the door because she's talking about her son driving. She said, I want him to slow down. So I'm holding on to the door and I'm praying to God. I'm saying, please, God, let us get home safely. Please, God, let us get home safely. And I look at my son and as I'm praying and as I'm terrified, he's smiling and saying, don't worry, I got this. And when she said this to me, I said, well, yes, I've been in that situation with my brother and whatnot. And she said, that is how I feel every time my son leaves the house now. Because he may have a gun in his pocket and he may be sure that he's going to be okay. But I sit at home and I wait by the door and I pray until he comes back home. And so I think when she said that to me, it kind of put into, because I was sitting there and saying, you need to be politically involved and we need to talk about security. And it really brought me back to the fact that this very much is, for a lot of women, it's not just about women. Security is not just, women's involvement in security is not just about women. Every time their kids go to school, they worry about when their kids will come back. When resources are given to a community, a municipal council, women don't think of how they're going to create the next seaport to increase trade. They also think of how they're going to create safe roads so their kids can go safely to school or safely to the soccer pitch. So, I mean, for me, it really put it in perspective that the work we're doing doesn't only influence women and it can't only be driven by women. It has to be driven by people like her young son, who is the one in the driver's seat currently. So,
what is the reality of violence against women in Libya?
Very much like the rest of the world, it exists. despite the fact that people never want to seem to admit.
It's taboo and
everywhere
to talk about it.
Everywhere. And it's extremely unfortunate. And, you know, I think when we talk about violence against women, people always assume you're immediately talking about physical violence. And so they say, well, no, I've never hit a woman. Or, you know what, my husband has never hit me. And we have to start talking about violence in all its forms. So emotional violence, psychological, neglect, all of these things add up, and all of these things affect a person and a person's character and their desire and their confidence to do more in the community. And so I think we really do need to start having more conversations about violence against women and about psychological manipulation and things like that, and really just ensuring that we create a society in which women feel more confident as leaders.
Her view on the future of women's rights in Libya. Dr. Alaa Murabit is my guest in WOW. More after this. Welcome to WOW, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. My special guest is Dr. Alaa Murabit, practicing pediatrician, and really a voice when it comes, a formidable voice when it comes to women's empowerment over in Libya. She is, after all, the founder of the Voice of Libyan Women. Dr. Murabit, do you primarily still look at women's issues through the prism of religion in Libya, through your public campaigns? And can you share more about the Noor campaign?
Mm-hmm. Well, we began the Noor campaign in July 2012, and it really started, the reason we started with 3 months of media, and then we focused more on seminars in schools, universities, and mosques. And the reason we started with media, which was billboards, television, radio, was really to start the conversation in a very indirect way. So families would see this billboard and be like, whoa, you know, that's a verse from the Quran supporting women's rights, and start that internal conversation and then bring it to schools, where it would be more direct and more kind of, you know, blunt. And it was outstandingly successful, and the campaign actually only wrapped up about 2 months ago and is now being replicated throughout the region. And the reason I believe it was successful was because we approached the situation not in a, this is a women's issue. Mm-hmm. This is a community and a family issue. And so we approached men and boys equally as much as we did women and girls. We went to all boys high schools and discussed violence against women and women's rights with them. And we did it with the support of the religious authority in Libya, saying that these are, you know, fully applicable hadiths and verses. And we did it with the support of government. So we had the Ministry of Interior and Education. We had the Ministry of I believe in Ministry of Interior, Education, Social, and Culture. And we also did it with the support of local municipal councils, and we did it through city teams, as I said earlier. So we had locals going to local families, people that they've been growing up next to their whole lives, saying, this is what violence against women is, and this is what women's rights is. And it changed the conversation because it wasn't coming from, you know, an outsider to their community. It was coming from somebody they know and trust. And the message was something that was embedded in their own faith, that they could go and look up in religious texts and see, this is how I should be treating women. So
this sounds very much like the sort of conversations I've read that you experienced growing up, being nurtured in your family environment, where the role of women, as dictated by Islam, was something that was openly debated.
Yeah, no, when I was growing up, my parents were very open to having conversations about the role of women in Islam, to the point where I never felt that it was in any way deviated from their ability to be successful doctors or entrepreneurs or politicians. So I never felt that it was any different than what the international standards of women's rights are. And I think that culture does play a very significant role, and that's why the Noor campaign really tries to dissect the religion from the culture so that people can no longer use religion against women. And it can be very clear that religion supports women. Islam supports women in education. It supports women in policy. It supports women in security. It supports women in their homes, right? Like, it protects women. And it really is, it just is about ensuring that people understand that basis and where that's coming from.
Men are very much part of the conversation, of course, on women's rights. Emma Watson just gave a terrific speech at the UN over the weekend about her views as a feminist and the importance of men in the movement. And since then, she's been greeted with hoax threats of, I think, leaking so-called nude photos of her. And public reaction to that has been, oh, look, a woman once again facing misogyny in the world simply because predicated on the preface that she's a woman, because she spoke up, because she had an opinion. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is a great deal of misogyny still in the world?
I think there is misogyny, and I also think there's a lack of awareness and education. And I think that that's probably more key. It's very easy to become defensive and angry and aggressive and say, you know what, people are being, mean to me because I'm a woman and there's misogyny. There's no doubt about that. But there's also men who, if you sit down and have a conversation about what women's rights is, and if you sit down and say, economically, this is why it benefits, politically, this is why it benefits, socially, these are the benefits, then you can actually create a dialogue. And that, I think, is the step that we need to take. I think we need to stop being on the fence and say, okay, well, we're going to continue to talk about women in these closed room with only women. And to me, that doesn't make sense. You need to bring the men in. And even if the conversations are tough in the beginning, they'll get easier. And once you create a cycle where you're educating girls and boys, and after their education comes economic power and comes political change, then you can actually create a cycle and a dynamic where there will ultimately be gender equality.
What have the range of reactions been towards meeting primal anger or misogyny with education, in your opinion?
What do you mean, sorry?
What has your experience been when you try to... earlier on, my audio engineer asked whether any man has ever heckled you.
Oh.
And you said, yes. So
a lot of women have too.
Okay.
Anybody who tends to disagree with you usually see what we do, and particularly in the Middle East, is we personalize intellectual conversations. We personalize things very quickly, right? So in Libya, I'll talk about women's rights and someone will attack me as a person or abroad, right? And it's common. It happens everywhere, much like you were talking about Emma Watson now. Your person gets attacked. Your character gets attacked. Your integrity. And it's something that I think I have initially was very difficult, and you have to get thick skin. But I understand comes from a place of fear and comes from a place of just not understanding. And so it means that I'm not doing my job because I have not sat down and I have not explained where I'm coming from properly enough. Because had I done that, had I made that other person feel as though they're involved and feel as though they are part of the solution, they are not the problem, then they would not have felt the need to attack me. So I think it really just is about ensuring that you're having the conversations you need to have and being inclusive of everybody, even those who you may not think will be your biggest supporters. Because you'll be surprised at how people's perceptions and how people's opinions change once you actually have a conversation with them.
And that is why she has been named Trust Woman Hero Award finalist by Thomson Reuters Foundation, one of the 25 women under 25 to watch by Newsweek, and the Trust Woman Hero by the International New York Times. My special guest, Dr. Alaa Murabit, showing how she meets challenges with such equanimity. Special guest for the Singapore Committee of UN Women for the Snow 2014 Gala. My thanks to Singapore Committee of UN Women as well for the great opportunity. Such a privilege it was to speak with Dr. Alaa Murabit. In case you missed the first half of this program, there'll be an encore broadcast of WOW tomorrow. You can also catch the full program on YouTube. Thanks for listening to Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the WOW Club on 938 Live.